Hey squad, welcome back, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. Today, I'm returning to the topic of Denethor and Theoden. Last week I published a video about each man's understanding of their role in history, and how this affected their choices. This time I'm looking at the similarities between each character's narrative in more detail. Though they are remembered very differently, these two men have a lot in common, too much for it to be coincidental. Some of their more superficial qualities are easy to spot. Denethor is Steward of Gondor, Theoden is King of Rohan, two realms that have long been linked. Both are tall and vigorous, but also clearly entering their twilight years. In fact, both were prematurely aged, in part by the mental struggles of resisting malicious counsel. When we meet them, both Theoden and Denethor are mourning their sons' deaths in battle, and their distrust of their surviving heirs has led to a degree of estrangement. They also start off quite resentful of Gandalf and suspicious of his advice. Each formally receives a hobbit into their service, who sticks around to bear witness to their final moments. Both die on the same day, indeed nearly at the same time, with Éowyn coming to the defense of the fallen Theoden as Gandalf tries to reason with a maddened Denethor. And after their deaths, Denethor's son Faramir marries Theoden's niece Éowyn, uniting their families. As the patron who suggested this topic points out, even their names are practically anagrams of each other, so it really seems like Tolkien is pulling out all the stops to get us to compare the two characters. And when we look at the main difference between the two, it's easy to get a general idea of why. While Denethor succumbs to despair and chooses to immolate himself rather than continuing to fight, Theoden rides valiantly into battle and meets a glorious end. Thus, Theoden is remembered as a hero and rekindler of hope, laid to rest in honor with songs of praise. Denethor, on the other hand, doesn't even leave behind a body, and the details of his death are so upsetting that at first they can't even be told to his convalescent son. The vastly different legacies of each character make it tempting to view them only in light of their final moments, noticing the evidence of Theoden's courage and Denethor's despair, but overlooking their complicated development. This risks obscuring something even more striking than their similarities, the way the trajectories of their development are inversions of each other. Denethor's arc is a mirror image of Theoden's. Each man faces the same set of crucial decision points, but they show opposing reactions to the events of the narrative. As a result of these choices, Theoden gradually begins to demonstrate more and more nobility, selflessness, and radical hope, while Denethor descends into hysteria and bitter cruelty. This parallel structure gives us some insight into Tolkien's ideas about the role of choice in determining the impact the characters are able to leave behind. Well before the ring is discovered or the quest begun, both men have begun to decline in physical and mental health. Appendix A tells us the spells of Saruman caused Theoden's decline, along with the deceitful leechcraft of his counselor Grima. After the death of his wife, Denethor is aged before his time by the terrific mental strain of using the Palantir. Each man is thus vulnerable because of a tainted source of information, Grima in Theoden's case and the Palantir in Denethor's. Both man and stone started out as helpful, or at least neutral. Gandalf says of Grima, "See Theoden, here is a snake, but it was not always as it now is. Once it was a man, and did you service in its fashion." The Palantir too was useful, especially at first. Because of his great mental strength and legitimate right to use the stone, Denethor escapes being overpowered by the will of Sauron. But while the information he receives through the stone is accurate in itself, Sauron begins to manipulate his perceptions. Gandalf later surmises the knowledge which he obtained was doubtless often of service to him, yet the vision of the great might of Mordor that was shown to him fed the despair of his heart until it overthrew his mind. Despite this common starting point, the early days of the War of the Ring find each man in a very different position. Denethor knows that trouble is afoot and begins preparing for an assault. He sends Boromir north to bring news to Imladris and seek Elrond's advice, and meanwhile he continues to keep a close eye on developments in other lands. Theoden, meanwhile, ends up increasingly dependent on a single source of information, his sycophantic counselor Grima Wormtongue, who is working on behalf of Saruman. Rohan becomes increasingly shut off from the rest of the world and hostile to any strangers. At the beginning of the War of the Ring, Gandalf emerges as a key figure in each man's story. His involvement with Denethor and Theoden is a further example of the inverted structure of each storyline. Gandalf begins by traveling to Minas Tirith to search the archives, where he is welcomed, albeit grudgingly, by the steward. After finding the Tale of the Ring and confirming its identity at Bag End, he goes to Isengard, where he is imprisoned. Upon escaping, he heads to Edoras, where he'd previously been a more welcome guest, but this time his warnings to Theoden fall on deaf ears and he is essentially thrown out. Returning from death as the White, Gandalf retraces his steps. He starts by going back to Edoras astride the very horse he borrowed last time. And this time, despite a discourteous reception, Theoden does end up taking his counsel to heart. Then Gandalf stops again at Isengard, where it is his turn to oversee the imprisonment of Saruman. Finally, he returns to Minas Tirith, where he finds Denethor's wariness flaring into open mistrust and resentment, until by the end Denethor actively rejects Gandalf's appeals in favor of a fiery end. This last visit from Gandalf either coincides with or directly causes a critical turn in each man's development. From this point on, the events of each man's story will be nearly identical, but they will elicit drastically different reactions. When Gandalf returns to Edoras, Theoden is sunk in despondency and weakness, thinking only of preserving Rohan's safety a little bit longer. His reliance on Grima Wormtongue is widely known. In fact, the degree of Grima's control over Theoden is obvious to everyone but him. It is up to Gandalf to reveal Grima's treachery and then to bring news of events outside of Rohan, including some intimations of the ring. Denethor's reliance on the Palantir, by contrast, is a secret, and remains unknown even by Gandalf until the very end. When Gandalf brings news of the goings-on in Rohan, Denethor tells Gandalf, "I know already sufficient of these deeds for my own counsel against the menace of the East. Yea, for though the stones be lost, they say, still the lords of Gondor have keener sight than lesser men, and many messages come to them." In their exchanges with the White Rider, both men learn something about the reasons for Aragorn's presence and Frodo's desperate mission. Aragorn declares his identity as Elendil's heir before he even enters Meduseld, and Gandalf is able to privately explain some things about the ring to Theoden, revealing an unexpected glimmer of hope. His voice was low and secret, and none save the king heard what he said, but ever as he spoke the light shone brighter in Theoden's eye, and at last he rose from his seat to his full height. By contrast, Gandalf is trying to keep much of this information from Denethor, or at least to control how it is revealed. But through his questioning of Pippin, his use of the Palantir, his own shrewd guesses, and finally his son Faramir's well-meaning reports, Denethor ferrets out nearly everything without Gandalf's help. Indeed, despite Gandalf's attempts to keep a lid on things. His unfortunate but understandable response is a deepening mistrust and bitter disappointment at what he sees as a grave risk that could have been avoided. Gandalf and his companions arrive in Edoras to find Theoden has recently learned of his son Theodred's death, and thrown his remaining heir, his nephew and adoptive son Éomer, into prison for the crimes of riding out to repel invading orcs and failing to detain travelers he found in the king's territory. In Éomer's case, letting Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli go was a direct violation of Theoden's commands, but as Gandalf provides further details, Theoden realizes that although he defied orders he considered corrupt, Éomer has always been loyal. So Theoden reconciles with his nephew, placing his trust in him to lead Rohan after Theoden's death. When Gandalf meets Denethor, he likewise has recently learned of his eldest son's death, and his younger son arrives from his, state-sanctioned, Eastern Patrol, also carrying news of strangers with an urgent errand that he allowed to go free. Unlike Éomer, Faramir is technically allowed to use his discretion in such matters. And when he returns, he expresses the hope that his decision wasn't the wrong one, pointing out that if he had known his father's opinions on the matter, he might not have been taken so off guard. While Denethor doesn't question Faramir's right to ask as he did, he criticizes Faramir for acting as though he cares about Denethor's opinion. Why do you ask? The men were under your command. Or do you ask for my judgment on all your deeds? Your bearing is lowly in my presence, yet it is long now since you turned from your own way at my counsel. Have I not seen your eye fixed on Mithrandir, seeking whether you said well or too much? He has long had your heart in his keeping. Another of Gandalf's goals is to remind each man of their duties. As king, Theoden can't afford to outsource the business of ruling to someone else. He has to take matters into his own hands and lead his people directly. When he asks Gandalf for his advice, Gandalf tells him, "You have yourself already taken it. To put your trust in Éomer rather than in a man of crooked mind, to cast aside regret and fear, to do the deed at hand." Denethor, on the other hand, has been ruling steward for so long now that, for all intents and purposes, he's acting like the king he technically is not. Gandalf reminds him that as Steward, he is supposed to relinquish his control of the city in the event that this service should no longer be required of him, such as if the king were to return. But Denethor's suspicions about Gandalf's involvement in the return of an actual king only make him more resistant to outside counsel. Both men thus reach a point of equilibrium as direct confrontation with Sauron draws closer, struggling against doubt and desperation. Theoden is ever more aware that the coming storm will threaten not just Rohan and Gondor, but the whole world, including the fate of all mankind for generations to come. Yet he's also started to entertain the hope that at least his own actions may not be wholly meaningless. Denethor has had at least an academic understanding of what's at stake for a long time, but as his labors to prepare and defend are overwhelmed, he retreats further into himself, taking counsel with himself alone, and seeing evidence of fatal weakness and foolishness even in his own son. Despite the best efforts of both men, Minas Tirith and with it the last hope of forestalling an outright invasion from Mordor is poised to fall. As Theoden approaches the city, he sees grim signs of how poorly the siege is going for the defenders, including the body of Hirgon, who was supposed to be bringing news of the rider's approach. In the face of this bleak situation, Theoden rallies his men by reminding them of their oaths to Lord and Land and League of Friendship, promising though you fight upon an alien field, the glory that you reap there shall be your own forever. His words and actions serve as an implicit promise that the sacrifice Theoden's riders are about to make will not be meaningless, even if they do not achieve victory. Meanwhile, after consulting the Palantir and finding only more evidence of Sauron's overwhelming might, Denethor takes up a vigil by his injured son, paralyzed by a sense of helplessness that strongly recalls Theoden's original despair. His face is gray and deathlike, and he even starts using a staff to walk. He refuses to pay any more heed to the defense of the city and instead starts releasing his people from their duties. Informed that defenders are abandoning their posts, he replies, "Why do the fools fly? Better to burn sooner than later, for burn we must," questioning not the point of continuing to resist the siege, which Denethor has already given up on, but the point of trying to escape death. He seems unaware that his men may be motivated by concerns other than the exact formulation of the oaths they have taken. Officially released from Denethor's service, Pippin tells him, "I will take your leave, sir, but from my word and your service I do not wish to be released while you live. And if they come at last to the Citadel, I hope to be here and stand beside you, and earn perhaps the arms that you have given me." As the end draws near, both men face a moment of overwhelming dread, which appears to onlookers as a sudden onset of weakness and old age. Theoden sees that his riders have arrived too late after all to keep the city from falling, and sits as if stricken suddenly by anguish or by dread. He seemed to shrink down, cowed by age. Pippin watches Denethor likewise bowing under the weight of despair as he sits beside Faramir. As he watched, it seemed to him that Denethor grew old before his eyes, as if something had snapped in his proud will, and his stern mind was overthrown. Grief maybe had wrought it, and remorse. He saw tears on that once tearless face, more unbearable than wrath. Denethor hopes to end his life before losing control of his city and his people, securing his son's death alongside his own. But when he is challenged by Gandalf and betrayed, as he thinks, by those among his men who actually have his best interests at heart, he wavers, trembling and weeping. He hears his delirious son calling for him, but knows, as Gandalf tells him, that neither his death nor Faramir's is properly his to command. At this point, neither man has anything left to lose, and this fills them both with a frenzied energy. When Theoden hears the impact of Grond upon the gates, the bent shape of the king sprang suddenly erect. Tall and proud he seemed again. Fey he seemed, or the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up on Snowmane like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the Battle of the Valar when the world was young. Theoden flings himself into the battle, killing a chieftain of the Haradrim. He stands fearlessly against the Witch King and thus meets his end, as his own horse cannot withstand the panic the Nazgul inspire. Like Theoden, Denethor appears renewed by an inner fire. He stood up tall and proud again, and lo, he had between his hands a Palantir. And as he held it up, it seemed to those that looked on that the globe began to glow with an inner flame, so that the lean face of the Lord was lit as with a red fire, and it seemed cut out of hard stone, sharp with black shadows, noble, proud, and terrible. His eyes glittered. Yet the steward uses this vigor to reject his duties with finality and thoroughness by lighting his own pyre. He dies with the palantir in his hands, rendering the very tool he once wielded in the service of Gondor unusable. Focused forever on the single moment of nihilistic anguish that serves as the last ruling steward's legacy. And it was said that ever after, if any man looked in that stone, unless he had great strength of will to turn it to other purpose, he saw only 2 aged hands withering in flame. Even though Theoden and Denethor undergo a strikingly similar series of experiences, that certainly doesn't mean that they're identical characters. For one thing, they show many innate differences of temperament, with Denethor being wiser and more self-contained, but also colder and more arrogant. The two rule different realms, each with its own distinct domestic concerns and cultural considerations. They're also under different influences. Shaking off the manipulations of a treacherous but mortal counselor is something very different than repeatedly doing mental battle against Sauron himself. Finally, for whatever reason, Gandalf is able to understand the root of Theoden's infirmity and addresses it, while he remains unaware of Denethor's palantir until the end, and any counsel he tries to give seems to make Denethor more suspicious. Clearly, all these factors influence each character's attitudes and choices. But the mirroring of the events that transform them shows that from Tolkien's perspective, it's the responses each man chooses that determined their development, not simply their circumstances. Denethor isn't destined to immolate himself any more than Theoden is guaranteed an inspiring, courageous death. In fact, Denethor arguably starts out with more advantages and a better outlook than Theoden has when we first encounter him. The dramatic impact of each man's death is made all the more intense by the tremendous change it demonstrates, yet the change itself happened gradually, and at any point the characters had the ability to turn from the path they were on. In upholding his duties, both royal and humane, Theoden achieved the very thing he despaired of, preserving Gondor and with it the hope of Middle-earth. Convinced he had no hope of success, Denethor renounced responsibility for his country, his men, his child, and finally, even for himself. The parallel arcs of Theoden and Denethor, one rising from listless gloom to legendary valor, the other sinking from undaunted nobility to spitefulness and waste, show that a man's fate is not ultimately determined by his temperament or beliefs, his powers of mind or body, the actions of those around him, or even forces beyond his control. What's more important are the repeated decisions to accept from moment to moment what duty demands, regardless of the outcome. If you enjoyed this video, do the deed at hand by hitting the like button. Subscribe to summon aid from the provinces, if by aid from the provinces you mean more videos from me, and don't forget to light the beacon fire of the notification bell. Thanks to everyone for watching, especially the patrons whose support keeps me away from my own metaphorical pyre, including John H. Austin Jr., Gandalf the Grey, Marcel Ribeiro, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Bitso Bongo, Dorwin Gray, Kevin Gilstat, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, Frankie 12-String, Luke, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, and Jared Carver. If you're interested in joining, you can click the link in the description. Until next time, may your gates remain unbreached and your swords unrusted.